I'm sorry we're a bit tardy, but thank you all for coming this evening. It's such a great pleasure to have James Glickman here this evening to present on his new book, The Crossing Point. I will just read a small précis of the book to give you some idea of what pleasure is ahead of us. Based closely on the known historical record, Crossing Point brings to life the American Revolution in all of its bloody detail. And I will leave it at that. Just suffice to say that Professor Glickman is an instructor at the Community College of Rhode Island. He lives locally, and we are so thrilled to have him here amongst us this evening to introduce his book and to do a book signing afterwards. Copies of the book will be available if anybody would like to purchase one, and we can have it signed. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much.
Welcome.
Thank you. So I researched this book for 7 years, and I wrote it for 3 years, and I rewrote it for 1 year after that. And there's a English essayist named Samuel Johnson, beloved of English professors everywhere, who said, "That which is written without much effort is in general read without much pleasure." And if that's true, the book should be okay. That's my hope and expectation. So I want to talk to you. I'll try and keep, respect your time. I'll try and keep it limited to under an hour. And my plan is to talk a little bit about the era, to talk a bit about the book, and then I'll read some to you, and not a terribly long couple of passages. First, I wanted to tell you I have three hows and one why as to how I wrote this book. The first how is, and I only thought of this after I wrote the book. I think the 18th century can seem pretty far away to most of us, but if you, as I do, live in Sturbridge, it's just around the corner, Old Sturbridge Village, and my wife and I have been there scores of times. Our son went to camp there. He even became a counselor, and became an interpreter there afterwards. And so the 18th century doesn't seem far away to me, but it does to a lot of people, and that's one of the things I want to talk about today, this evening. First of all, I think I think in the popular imagination, the 18th century seems odd, with bewigged people looking over their spectacles and speaking in a funny language, and that it doesn't seem as present or vivid as, say, the Civil War, which could be recorded and was recorded by Matthew Brady in dramatic detail. And one of the things I'm going to do is explore that imagery. The second how I came to write this is every year for over 20 years, I taught an African American literature survey class at the Community College of Rhode Island. And I used to get a paper check, remember those days? That said on it, Rhode Island and its Providence Plantations. And one day a student asked me, why is it called Rhode Island and its Providence Plantations? And I had no idea. So I decided to research it, and that kind of brings me to the third how for I wrote this. My ignorance of the era and the details of it was vast. I was raised in the Midwest, and I don't know about what sort of general public education you had. I'm sure yours is. It's much better than, in general speaking, for history than mine. But I was raised on myths, effectively. George Washington could never tell a lie, and about cutting down the cherry tree, and he threw a silver dollar across the Potomac, and so on. I was just trying to find out the answer to that question, why is it Rhode Island and its Providence Plantations? I discovered about the whole history of and role of slavery in Rhode Island over that period. And for example, I didn't know, but do now, that 60% of the North American slave trade went through Newport. It was a major, pivotal place for the slave trade. In southern Rhode Island, about 1 out of 5 people was African colonial, I guess you'd say, because they weren't Americans yet. There were lots of African Americans in Rhode Island, and the slave trade was crucial to their economy. There's a recent book on this, and I won't rehearse all of it, but I'll just mention quickly that if you try and unpack how the slave trade works, you'll see that everything that's needed to support it, from shipbuilding and carpentry and tar manufacturing and the distilling of molasses into sugar and rum to bring it back for the horrible slave trade triangle, took up almost essentially the whole economy of Rhode Island. And I'll get to a little bit later what they made of that. But finding out these things, and including, and I imagine most of you know this, but you may not, there was an all-black regiment, which is the center part of my novel, that was raised partway through the Revolutionary War as things were going very badly, and they needed help. And they decided in Rhode Island to raise, and did, an all-black regiment. The third how on this was that I discovered that there is almost no African-American testimony of any kind. There are no diaries, there are no letters. It isn't just a question, though, of literacy. One of the characters I examined is not in my novel, although he was in an early version of it, but he didn't make the cut. Was a wonderful polymath, brilliant clergyman named Ezra Stiles, who had and he was a patriot, meaning he was in favor of freedom. He had a slave named Newport, and he was a mentioner of everything. He was an intense diarist, correspondent with people all over the world. He told you how much he weighed, what he ate for breakfast, how many cords of wood he burned that day. He just mentioned everything. The weather, as an Enlightenment figure, just to give you a little backdrop, that the more information you had, the closer you were to God. So the more information he could find, he felt closer to God. He almost never mentioned his servant, as he called him, Newport. And he ultimately manumitted him, freed him, when he discovered that you can't be a patriot fighting for your freedom and be a slave owner, and a clergyman, this is too hypocritical to support. I was curious what became of Newport. He doesn't tell you. Although ultimately, because he was a patriot, Newport was occupied by the British. He ended up in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and was, before he became president of Yale, after which there was a college named after him, Ezra Stiles. He got a report. In his diary, he mentions that Newport came back and became, as he described, a member of the family. So that's all I could find out. I'm trying to find out what was the experience like for African Americans in early America. And there's an enormous gap there that can't be recovered by historians. To respect our wonderful historian here, Manisha Sinha. It's something, however, that creates a great space for fiction. And that was why I wanted to write this novel. That's 3 hows and a why. Now, to tell you before I'm going to try something. I haven't tried this. I've done numbers of readings, but I haven't tried projecting an image on this. The received image we have of the Revolutionary era. I think people underestimate how violent this war was. In respect to one of our kind audience members was disquieted by the amount of violence in my novel. But I think I, in some ways, understated it. The number of dead in combatants, not civilians, number of dead in the Revolutionary War was 5 times higher than the number of dead per capita in World War II from the United States, 10 times higher than World War I. If you were to convert the number of dead, combatant dead, to our present population, you'd have 3 million dead. So it was and I think the image a lot of us had, and I would not exclude myself before I studied this, was of these people who needed to see the whites of somebody's eyes before you could hit them. And they all wore, elegant uniforms and toppled over like little bottles. That's not an accurate picture of things. There were riflers in the American companies from Virginia, for example, who could hit someone at 600 yards. There were cannon and howitzers and bombs, as they called them, the shells that would explode. It was a very bloody, violent engagement. That's not the heart of my novel, but it's I try to follow what the data told me, and so that's what I presented. I think also times, they say that history doesn't repeat itself, but it may rhyme. If you look at early America, they were very divided. Roughly 1/3 of Americans were patriots, 1/3 were loyalists, and 1/3 were undecided and wondered how this was going to all work out. There were neighbors spying on neighbors to report on them. There were spies themselves. One of the characters in my novel, one of the main characters in my novel, close family friend, was someone named Benjamin Church, who was the first Surgeon General of the United States, and he was a British spy, which they found out when they intercepted a coded message he was sending from Newport to ship offshore. There's a guy who was the Rhode Island Speaker of the House. His name was Metcalf Bowler. And they didn't find out until 1910, when they went through his letters and diaries, that he was a spy. He was on the payroll. So we've been hacked before. We've had divided times before. People were divided by region. They were divided by race. They were divided by religion. They were divided by class. And I think history still, alas, rhymes in that way, and others. I want to make a note I wanted to check on here. Civilians themselves were unprotected from the war that went on around them, and many of them were forced into bankruptcy and ended up on the poor rolls of the towns to support them, as happens to one of my characters, and did happen. My novel is extremely closely based on the history, except for the characters I had to invent because there's no historical record. Almost everyone is based on historical fact. And by the way, I knew where my characters were from 1775 until late 1778. I knew where they were every day during that period. However, I'm not an historian, and should you ask me any questions that are about 1774 or 1779, I'm going to be no better than anyone else. The British won almost every single encounter that they were involved in militarily in the opening years of the war, which is one of the reasons we had, one of the reasons Washington, that Southern gentleman who was the largest slave owner in the country, who was a more estimable figure to my shock and surprise than I had imagined. One of the things that I learned in doing the research is that some people are even better than you think. And he's one, actually. But he authorized raising this troop, despite his own circumstances and views. And doing this research, I ran across 2 historical characters that I wanted to explore, actual characters. One is named Sam Ward, a white guy who was the grandson and son of Rhode Island governors. He went to Brown University at age 12, graduated at 15, had almost everything going for him. And I wondered what he became early on a captain at age 18 when the war opens. And I'm wondering what's it like to be him. The other major character that I wondered about also existed historically, and I know what I could find out about him, at least the lineaments of it. Someone named Guy Watson, who became governor of the, there is a, I don't know how to explain this in a brief way, but I'll try. Every year, as a celebration, they would have an election of slave governors in Rhode Island. And part of it was a celebration where they weren't lectured at, they got to play games and drink and dance, even, you know, cider, meaning hard cider, and dance and celebrate. But they also elected officials who they used, some historians say, to enforce discipline. They used African Americans to enforce discipline on other African Americans, to effectively punish them for misbehavior. So it's a complicated question. Guy Watson becomes, who is a slave, becomes a slave governor, is elected for it, which he's not certain he wants to be at all. But he's someone who goes from being a slave to very different circumstances. And I'm wondering, what is it like to follow his life trajectory? And the two of them, Sam Ward and Guy Watson, intersect repeatedly. And I'll read you a passage later where they do in a pivotal way. Here's the thing I'm going to try to see if we can get some understanding and insight into the way we perceive and think of, and I don't mean to speak for you, I can only speak for myself on this. Some of you may have very sophisticated understandings of the Revolutionary War era, but I think all of us have received images because we don't have documents, visual documents. We have paintings. And I'm going to, if I can have your assistance, we're going to look at a painting, and I hope we can all analyze it together. Do you mind a little audience participation? Excellent. This painting, and we'll turn off the lights here, great, I hope you can see it better. This painting is by John Trumbull. He was a colonel, John Trumbull, in the Revolutionary War. And this is a painting at Bunker Hill that was extraordinarily famous in its time. You can see it, by the way, at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, if you want to get a good close look at it. I'm just curious, how many of you know who Joseph Warren was? General Joseph, he was a general. A number of you, three, is that right? 3, 4 of you, yeah. He was one of the most famous members of the Revolutionary era when, and we're about to see a painting of his death, which occurred at Bunker Hill. Along with Sam Adams, John Hancock, Paul Revere, Joseph Warren was one of the great bases for the American Revolution, philosophically, personally, and dramatically. And when he died, it was a tragic event to the people at the time. In fact, he was so well known and appreciated that in the 10 years after he died, more towns and streets were named after Joseph Warren than were named after George Washington. He was an exceptionally important figure. This is Joseph Warren. And art historians, and I've consulted a very good one who has a recent book on it, who spoke at Ulsterbridge Village quite effectively on this, thinks this is one of the best paintings of the era. And it was certainly famous. It was done, now this occurred in 1775, but it wasn't painted until 1786, 11 years afterwards. But John Trumbull was there. He wasn't involved directly in combat, but he saw it happen. And all of these figures are identifiable to people of the time. This would be, they didn't need captions. They knew who they were. For example, and this tells you one of the things that, by the way, when you see this, doesn't this seem mannered and remote? No? Does this seem like a battle scene to you?
Good death.
Good death, right. Well, I'm going to pause for a second. Does anything about it strike you? And I'm not fishing for an answer. I'm just interested in what you see or think or how you react when you look at this, or if it poses any questions for you. I know it's sort of hard to see, but.
Are most of those people from Rhode Island?
No, they're all from, the Redcoats are all British soldiers. He is someone named Lieutenant Grosvenor. I don't know if Grosvenor-Dale comes from him, but he's Lieutenant Grosvenor. This is Joseph Warren. And these people would have been very recognizable. The commander-in-chief of the British was Clinton, General Clinton. That's him right there. The admiral, the chief of the admiralty was, they called him as Richard Howe, Black Dick Howe. That's him. Trumbull painted this after the war was over. He was in London. The head of the British Academy of Arts was Benjamin West, another American. But there he is, Trumbull, and he wants to get a good likeness of Howe. So he asks Howe, can I paint your portrait? Howe refused to see him. So Benjamin West, who knew him well, photoshopped this in. That face is painted by Benjamin West. It's not painted by John Trumbull.
It looks like the British are winning and the Americans, or the Patriots, are retreating.
Well, it depends on how you define win. One of the things that they said, they took the field. However, their casualties were enormous. And as many people, including the British, said, one or two more victories like this and this war is over, meaning we'll lose. What happens, the Americans ran out of ammunition. They were well dug in. They would have probably repulsed a third attack, but when they ran out of ammunition, the British were able to continue the assault. A couple of things I wanted to point out, but I just wondered, is there anything else that you...
Is Washington at the far left?
No, Washington wasn't yet the commander. He didn't get appointed until after Bunker Hill. Actually, which, as you probably know, was Breed's Hill. It wasn't really Bunker Hill, but another matter. Can you find an African American?
Yes, that's what they're thinking.
Bottom right.
Bottom right. Now, I wish it were clearer and brighter and more focused. You might notice him, more. But there is one. If you do as I did, I was just curious because I was going to do this tonight. I wanted to know, so who is he? And guess what? He's either Lieutenant Grosvenor's servant, that's one identification. He's Peter Salem, which is another identification. And he's Salem Poor, which is a third identification. Now, which of these is right, I don't know, but Peter Salem fought at both Bunker Hill, in this case, he's holding a pistol. I can barely see that myself at this moment. I know that from looking at it more closely. He's holding a pistol, and they're retreating. The Americans are retreating. And this actually, at the end of the third assault, Joseph Warren was shot. Joseph Warren was shot in the head, and the musket ball came out his eye. This is in a tradition of painting, which European tradition, Academy of Arts. This is the Lamentation of Christ. Many paintings follow this same iconography, where the person in the foreground is dying rather beautifully and in a well-lit circumstance. And here, there are a couple of things that Trumbull did that were interesting to me. afterwards. Notice there's someone here, and he's identified variously by historians, who's got his hand on this bayonet that the British were about to use. Now, the British did bayonet many prisoners who tried to surrender. They just and Americans were unused to the idea of bayonets, and it was a particularly horrifying to them way to die. It was personal and gruesome. He's trying to stop it, but so is this man, who was Major Small, British major, who is reaching out here with his hand to stop him from bayoneting General Warren. He's even stepping over one of his own dead men, and if you Wikipedia this, you can identify almost all these people, including him. I think he's Colonel Abercrombie. And this is probably, this is speculation on the part of the art historian whom I mostly consulted. The Americans, the war was over, they wanted to put it behind them. They didn't want to dwell on how horrible, and by the way, the British, the death rate was so high because, to give you one metric, 70% of Americans who were captured by the British, and enormous numbers were, died in captivity. And they were usually put in prison ships offshore, and it was tough circumstances. But war's over, and when he painted this, and he wanted this to be better, to show the British being merciful, forbearing, dignified, good. So he's stopping that from happening. And the other thing, and there's no way you can see this on this screen, but even when I studied this carefully, I was thinking about presenting this, and guess what? There is another African American in this picture. And I don't think there's any way you could see him. He is right there. There's a tiny face with a head rag around it. So, and to me, at least in part, I think this reminds me of how history was experienced at the time and how we tend to receive it. This is the news. This is how we picture these things. Now, when Abigail Adams saw this painting, which she did the year it was shown, she said it made her faint of heart and her blood shivered. To her, this was horrifying, this painting. But I want to read you something about someone who was there to witness this and had a different reaction. This is a very good book. I recommend it. This is Of Arms and Artists, Paul Stady, if it interests you. He's an art historian at Mount Holyoke and spoke at Old Sturbridge Village, where I happened to learn about this. John Trumbull, as I said, was a colonel in the militia, the Continental Army. And he witnessed this, but this was the painting that he did, a rather sanitized version. And I'm going to read from this book briefly. The Terror of Bunker Hills, and he's describing what actually happened. 1,500 dead bodies, bloodied, mangled, and lying on the field on this. Nothing like this. The Terror of Bunker Hill traumatized Trumbull's sister, Faith, who joined the large crowds gathered on Beacon Hill to watch the spectacle. Like everyone else, she imagined it would be something grand and honorable. Instead, she heard the cries of men ripped apart by grape shot and saw the canopy of cannon and howitzer ordnance raining down on Charleston. She soon sank into a sobbing depression, and the day after Thanksgiving went to her bedroom and hanged herself. Okay. The experience is very different from, I think, what we see, imagine, and at least in popular imagination think. So I tried in my novel to be more realistic. But I'm no different from anyone who's did a painting in the 18th century. I'm living in my own time with my own beliefs, assumptions, and I'm sure someone could, if they were ever to happen to read this in years hence, they would say that's quaint or different or incomplete, but it's what I was able to do. So I'd like to do some reading here briefly and then open it up to any questions, okay? Okay. This is the opening of the novel, and it involves Guy Watson. The smoldering embers of the fire scent the fall air of the meeting room. Thin gray light filters through the thick leaded panes of the eastern windows. At the front wall, the 13 hearing officers range along the far side of a long oak dining table turned broadside, their faces alert. Escorted by the sergeant-at-arms to a small scarred desk at the center of the room and told to sit, Guy Watson settles himself, his hands gripping each other in his lap and the muscles in his neck and back knotted with tension. At a slanted writing desk next to the hearing officers, a secretary dips his quill in the inkwell, pauses, and hunching over it, begins to write. Guy, listening to the pen scratch in the silence, can feel the eyes of the officers level on him like gun muzzles. The man at the writing desk stops, rests the quill in its holder, and nods at the officers. The court-martial president, General Varnum, requests everyone to rise. The chair legs scrape the floor as everyone complies. General Varnum asks the 12 other officers to raise their right hands. You swear, he says, that you will well and truly try and impartially determine the cause of the prisoner now before you without partiality, favor, or hope of reward, so help you God. So help me God, the officers reply. General Varnum then tells the secretary to raise his right hand. You, Caleb Whipple, do swear that you will, according to the best of your abilities, accurately and impartially record the proceedings of the court and the evidence to be given in the case in hearing, so help you God. I so swear, replies the secretary. The general court-martial is now in session. They seat themselves. Guy, uncertain of what to do and not having been spoken to, remains standing. Varnum passes the secretary a paper to read aloud. He peers at the page for a moment, his lips moving silently as he reviews its contents. Then he clears his throat and reads in a thin, reedy voice, by direction of Brigadier General James Varnum, a general court-martial is hereby appointed to meet at East Greenwich, Rhode Island, on the 14th day of September 1778 for the trial of Lieutenant John Hazzard, Jr. and such other prisoners as may be brought before it, accused of violating Article 52, holding correspondence with or giving intelligence to the enemy, either directly or indirectly. Conviction of said crime shall result in death or such other punishment as shall be ordered by a sentence of the General Court-Martial. Secretary turns to Guy Watson and says, how do you plead? Guy's grip on his own hands tightens. He stands straight and unmoving. He's been told about this part and he knows he's supposed to say something. Here in the pale morning light of this room, with the officers looking at him and the word death still hanging in the air, he cannot, for the life of him, remember what it is he's supposed to say. The second and last part I'll read is of a pivotal moment in both Guy Watson and Sam Ward's life. And they intersect here. And I'm going to read the part where they cross paths and a very difficult, thorny decision has to be made by Guy Watson. They awakened to a chilly gray day, 6 days short of a full moon, carrying with it the smell of snow, but promising nothing else remarkable. He knew it was Thursday, this being Guy, and June, his wife, who could count better than he and kept closer track of these things, knew it was the 19th day of February. He would come to know this last bit of information before the morning was out, however, because it would be written on a piece of paper with what they said was his name next to it. 3 uniformed white men and a wiry black man appeared at the main house not long after breakfast. He recognized the one-time slave and part-time spy Jack Sisson, though he'd not seen the tall, rangy, blond man since he marched at the head of a column of men into the teeth of a blizzard and toward the walls of Quebec. Samuel Ward looked like a boy no more, his face lean and grave, his alert eyes serious. The master, his name is John Hazzard, and who was usually extremely self-possessed and never raises his voice, here is different. The master, face puffy from lack of sleep, and young John came out to meet meet them in the yard. After Guy took their horses, the master told them to work on the barn gate and for June to get to the dairy. When they lingered, the master broke into a near scream that astonished them all. "I said get to work now!" June, flinching as if at the report of a gun, scurried off as quickly as her large belly permitted. She's pregnant. Guy's work left him in easy earshot. Master John worked to control his temper and suddenly looked as if he were squinting, though the light was too gray to require him to do so. "I want you to know, Major, that his family has lent very important assistance to our state's defense, and it should not be called on to do so again in such irreversible terms." "I see," the Major said, "that you have guessed the purpose of our visit. You must already know that the new legislation permits us to reward you handsomely." "For what? For taking a man's property and livelihood?" the Master said. When the Major shook his head but said nothing, to this Master John said, "Isn't it enough that my son is in the militia? Having the governor of the slaves of Rhode Island will offer a reassuring presence and assist our recruitment." He saw a flash of hatred cross Master John's face. "I think governors are often greatly overestimated, don't you, Major Ward?" Just to remind you, his father and grandfather were governors. Astonished, Guy's pulse began to race. He lowered his head and pretended to work on his task. They were talking about him. He glanced up in time to see the Major's blue eyes frost to gunmetal gray. "Bring the man forward." "He must seek to enlist first," said Master Hazzard. "You're well acquainted with the new law. Then you will know that all we require is a willingness on the part of the slave to enlist. We do not require the permission of the master." "You cannot simply confiscate a man's property, sir. As I said, you'll be amply reimbursed." The master glared at him and said nothing. "It was our hope to compose this matter with you in a friendly way, but compose it we will." Guy could slowly see dawning on the master's face the awareness that the ward boy was a boy no longer. He blinked nervously even before Major Ward said to him in a voice full of command, "Call the man, call him now." For the first time, the master's eyes darted toward Guy. "All right, but I wish to speak to him in private. I will not be told on my own land to whom I may speak." No one said nay, Master Hazzard. "You will do us the courtesy of first letting us explain to him what this enlistment requires." Master John gestured toward the barn. "There he is. Captain Lewis, please read the authorizing act." The captain unfolded a piece of paper and started to read in a slow, halting voice. Guy gathered he had not yet read this passage often, and actually he was grateful for the slow pace. "Every able-bodied Negro," Lewis read, "mulatto or Indian man-slave in this state may enlist in the Continental Army in Rhode Island to serve during the continuance of the war with Great Britain. Every slave so enlisting shall, upon passing muster before the colonel, be immediately discharged from the service of his master or mistress and be absolutely free." Guy could follow the man's finger on the paper as he read. He noticed the last word, free, was printed in all big letters. This is true, by the way. On that document, the word free is all capitalized. "Free?" Guy asked Major Ward. "Forever," he replied. His heart raced and his eyes stung with the start of tears. The crack of daylight at last. It was almost too much for him to take in. The dream of his entire life, free. And then he thought, June. The froth of his elation settled, vanished. How could he leave her? Master John called him aside and behind the corner of the barn. Young John came along. "You don't have to do this, Guy, and I do not want you to do it. You must remain here with us. This is not the great and grand offer you think it is. If you go and the rebels lose, and I am certain they will, the British will punish you as a traitor. They could even hang you. And in any event, win or lose, you will be compelled to fight in the army, not just 1 year, or for 1 year, as others do, or even 2 or 3 years, but until this war comes to an end. Wars in Europe have lasted 30 years or more. You may never quit. You may never leave." The master stared intently in Guy's eyes to see how his arguments were working. Guy listened closely. "You will no longer be a servant to me and Mistress Hazzard, but you'll be a slave to military service. Even the rebels admit that their soldiers are now risking starvation at Valley Forge. You'll be in an army of whites, and I know you're too wise to believe that you will ever have anything but the poorest food and the worst and most dangerous kind of duty. You can, and almost certainly will be killed as easily as this. The master raised his hand in front of Guy's eyes and snapped his fingers with a loud pop. Guy nodded and hung his head. He guessed that everything the master said was likely true, but none of it would stop him for a second. Just tell the men no. Can't say no, can't say yes. Do you think they would be signing up Negroes if their war plans were going well? They are on the edge of ruin and are about to fall into disaster, man. When Guy said nothing, the master paused. Then he spoke more softly. What about June? Guy's head snapped up. Your wife, ready to give birth any day? You can't leave her. Maybe I buy her. The master snorted. Not on a private salary. No, Guy, you stay here. I'll reinstate your wages, share any cash you make working on others' farms. We'll work out your and June's freedom over time. Soon, too, I promise. When Guy said nothing, young John began to say through clenched teeth how mulish and ungrateful he was. His father silenced him with a look. We're offering you food and clothing and shelter and a doctor's care when you need it. We're offering to keep you and June and your baby together, safe and at home. Guy nodded, beginning to feel the force of his master's persuasive powers. You understand, Guy, how hard things have become, our having to sell off Juba and Lucy and losing Quimino, and they become hard again. If we lose you now and lose the value of your work, I honestly do not know how we will get by. This is not a threat. I am just explaining to you how things are. If we cannot get by, there is no way on earth of telling what will happen to June and your baby. Everything is auctioned off, sold to whoever makes a bid. Is that what you want? No, Master. Then tell the men no. Master John folded his arms across his chest and waited for an answer. From where they were standing, Guy could see into the opening door of the dairy. June was preparing the cheese press, and she pushed back a damp strand of hair from her forehead with the back of her hand. Guy could see in every gesture and every movement how worried she was. She turned and saw him and the master and young John, and her hand flew to her mouth. I say no, Guy said, his voice hoarse. The master nodded in satisfaction. Good. You won't be sorry. Three of them returned to the yard at the front of the main house. Major Ward raised his hand. Before you say anything, we need to tell you two things. I'm told you have a wife here. Guy nodded. I wanted to assure you there are laws that prevent your master from selling her out of state. Guy looked at him impassively, thinking, he doesn't know Gambling John Hazzard. The major then turned to the master and said, these are laws which you have violated twice already when you sold 2 of your slaves last year. We know this. He held up several pieces of paper and have the documents to confirm it. Attorney General Marchant has informed me, however, that he does not intend to prosecute unless you should attempt to violate the law again. Young John blurted, what if we're forced into insolvency? His father glared at him as if he didn't want this question asked. Major Ward continued to look steadily at young John. In case of insolvency, your servants are free to go as they wish. He turned to Guy. Do you have any questions before we proceed? Can I speak to my wife, sir? Ward nodded. Guy did not dare look at the master or his son as he walked off, but he could feel their glares upon him like knives. June waited at the dairy's entrance, her face full of anxiety and impatience. What? What? He explained the offer made to him, and her eyes grew wide. This is it, Guy. This is what Camino told us would come. You got to take it. But it only for men. No cooks, no washerwomen. This is your chance. It ain't never gonna come again. What about you? Her eyes grew fierce and brimmed with tears. She seized the lapel of his jackets and began to hit him. You got to go. For both of us, for the baby, you got to go. He tried to embrace her, but she battered his arms away. He tried again, and she pushed him back, hard. He nodded once, slowly. June grew still and her breathing slowed. You know where I keep my money? I know, she said. They hurried to their cabin. He took a gold half-joe for himself and left all the rest, warning her to keep it hidden well. He took a little piece of cloth from his mother's death dress and the tiny box of dirt from his father's grave and added them to his pouch of charms. He heard Jack Sisson calling his name. He embraced June hard in his arms, feeling her pregnant belly against him, inhaling her warm, coppery smell. And then he turned to leave, fighting with all his might the impulse to turn around. Sisson called again. He presented himself before Major Ward and said, I want to enlist. Master John swore bitterly, and the mask of confidence young John wore cracked, curdled, and fell away in shock. That's it. Thank you. We just have a couple of minutes left. Do you have any questions about anything that have to do at least with 1775 to 1778?
The trip to Quebec with Arnold, did you just pick that at random? Was there a reason you chose that campaign?
Actually happened, extraordinarily well documented. He went on it. Captain Ward was one of the people who went to Quebec. He goes, this is not a terrible spoiler alert, he goes from having everything to, as 1776 begins, being imprisoned for he has no idea how long in Quebec. He goes from freedom to, if you wish, slavery. So the parallels between the two characters were ones I could not resist. It's an extremely well documented and famous in its time, the journey to Quebec. I'm sorry?
We are talking about you in this novel this evening, and you talked about the novel. I mean, it's just amazing, I think, the way it captures the history of the period. So even though it's clear, it's so well researched, even though it's fiction, it reads like history sometimes.
That was my hope.
Yes, because it's so well researched and documented. But your portrayal of the war as this like very fratricidal, internecine war with a lot of violence involved. I was just wondering if you had looked at Holger Hooke's new book, Scars of Independence.
I have.
And how that, where history and literature are sort of coming together.
Yeah.
Do you think his portrayal sort of matches up with your portrayal of
Absolutely. I read that and felt greatly reassured that I hadn't gotten it wrong, because his book came out after my book was in galleys, and I have read it with great interest and admiration. And that's where I got the 70% figure from among the deaths of prisoners.
Sorry, I couldn't hear. What book was that she was talking about? Or?
Scars of Independence?
Scars of Independence.
Okay.
By and what's interesting about it is I took intentionally whatever American sources I could find. So I don't have, and which means some of it's fake news, right? But they believed it at the time. And what's interesting about this book, this is a German man who was educated at Oxford, who wrote about the American Revolution, and he tells it in a 360-degree, fair, rounded way, and it's a very good book. I will, yes.
You mentioned when you were saying the house, I think it was the house.
Yeah, and it's Providence Plantations.
What does that mean?
Well, I discovered that's the sort of odd thing. There's been a debate over the years in Rhode Island about whether they should remove that because it evokes the old plantation south.
Is that the official name of the
Still is.
Is it
Still
a
is.
state or a Commonwealth?
State. Well, it was picked by Roger Williams, founder of Rhode Island, had a biblical reference to it. And just like the Plymouth Plantation has no reference whatsoever to Southern plantation slave life, neither does Rhode Island and its Providence Plantations. However, while I was researching that, I found out all this other stuff. I couldn't just, the time I was doing this, I couldn't just go on the web and say, could you give me the straight answer and I'll ignore the rest. I'm looking through bookshelves and stuff. So.
I wonder how you ever find a minute to eat on McGilpin with all the research that's entailed. But when, in the beginning, I read it with hope. I loved reading about them going through the wilderness, going up to Canada. But towards the end, the overwhelming feeling I got that they must have had was being disheartened. Because coming over another breastwork was some more bayonets and chopping them off. And it seemed like there wasn't much hope at the end of this.
Well, I end this at the point at which the French, also is something called the Battle of Rhode Island, which actually happened, and the Hessian and other troops focused their assault on the Black Regiment, attacked them 3 times, and were repulsed 3 times. But the French entering the Revolutionary War was effectively like some small country that gets the U.S. to back it. They were a great, wealthy superpower, and it even at the time, they recognized we aren't going to have any problem with food, supplies, arms, clothing, anything. With France, we're gonna win. And that's what they felt. And what it required them to do was to continue that amazing persistence that they demonstrated before, during, and after. I did want to end this with, I'm sorry, it's also not a wonderful story, but it has an image associated with it. Is this all closed up? I have one more image I might show, just for your interest. The Rhode Island Regiment, just if you think it was all, we all pulled together and it was one big happy family, the most feared, among the most feared of all the British troops were American Loyalists. And the 1st Rhode Island Regiment in 1781 in Yorktown, New York, was assaulted by, it was Delancey's New York Loyalists. They went over, they sneaked in the middle of the night. They crept in with American guides. They attacked the officers' headquarters and maimed, they killed 3 of the officers and hacked one into pieces. And they, many of the African soldiers rallied to try and defend them, and there is an unknown number. They're buried in Yorktown is the former head of the Rhode Island Regiment, Colonel Green, and also his lieutenant, and an unknown number of black soldiers. Yorktown, the town of Yorktown has decided that there needs to be a monument, and they've raised $300,000 and chartered out an artist to present it, and I'm going to show you the image to show you that all art is not always wonderful. There's actually a British drawing of at the end of the war, the Revolutionary War, and that is very much the 1st Rhode Island Regiment was extremely well equipped, ultimately, well fed and well taken care of, and well officered. And they, in fact, that's the uniform. There's nothing wrong with that particularly. It's obviously sort of grand. But this is to evoke these 3 figures. There were Native Americans, often of mixed race, so they were identified as black, but actually were Native Americans, as well as African Americans, and Colonel Green. One of these is Colonel Green. One of these obviously is African American, and one is Native American. Who's the Native American? The barefoot one with the blonde hair? Yes. It's bad art. And that's an oxymoronic moment to end on it, but it's the right monument, right? All the monuments that are getting taken down all over the South should be taken down all over the South, and in their place they should tell a fuller story. And monuments like these, even if they are, I hope it doesn't come out looking like this, I hope they improve the Native American, is the right way to go. And I'm hopeful that my novel is a step in that direction. And I thank you all very much for coming, and appreciate it. If you have any questions, you want me to sign a book, I'll be glad to do so.
What was the name, what was the regiment?
1st Rhode Island Regiment.
It was this 1st Rhode Island Regiment?
Yep. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
So if anybody would like to buy a book, we will have them for sale, and we are able to offer a very attractive price of $12 because we got a nice discount from the publisher. So this is a unique opportunity, and I invite you to
So how much was it?
$12.
Yep.
So we have the Sounding Waters as well as Crossing Point. So if you are interested, please come this direction, and I'm sure Professor Glickman could be persuaded.
I can. Sounding the Waters is the first novel I wrote. It's a political novel, and the publisher thought that it might have something to say to our unpleasant historical moment about politics.